Hey guys, welcome to RedSunStories. Hope you're doing well. Tonight, discover the storm god who was banished from heaven for his rage, and how his quest for redemption led him to face an 8-headed serpent that had been devouring princesses for generations. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy what I do here. Now let's dive into tonight's story together. In the ancient province of Izumo, where the mountains rose like the teeth of sleeping dragons, and the rivers ran dark with the memory of rain, the people knew the language of storms. They understood the difference between the gentle rains that blessed the rice fields and the violent tempests that tore roofs from homes and uprooted ancient trees. They could read the sky as easily as a priest read sacred texts, interpreting every cloud, every shift in the wind. But on this particular evening, as the sun bled crimson across the western horizon and shadows lengthened like grasping fingers across the valley floor, the people of Izumo felt something different stirring in the air, something that made even the oldest among them, those who had weathered countless typhoons and lived through the fury of nature's worst tantrums, pause in their evening tasks and look toward the darkening sky with troubled eyes. The wind had changed. It no longer carried the familiar scent of rain and earth, but something else, something that tasted of metal and rage, of divine fury barely contained. The clouds that gathered on the horizon were not the usual gray harbingers of storm, but towering edifices of black and purple, shot through with veins of sickly green light that pulsed like the heartbeat of some vast, angry creature. In the village of Torigami, nestled in a valley where 7 streams met in a confluence of sacred waters, an old woman named Chiyo stood before her humble dwelling and watched those clouds approach. On her weathered hands, gnarled from decades of working the fields and weaving sacred ropes for the village shrine, trembled slightly as she clutched a prayer bead necklace. Her granddaughter, a girl of perhaps 10 summers named Hana, pressed close to her side, sensing the fear that her grandmother tried to hide. "Grandmother?" Hana whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind that now whipped through the valley, bending the bamboo groves until they groaned in protest. "What kind of storm is this?" Chiyo did not answer immediately. Her eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with the wisdom of years, remained fixed on those approaching clouds. She had seen many things in her long life. She had witnessed floods that swept away entire villages, earthquakes that split the earth like rotten fruit, fires that consumed forests in great walls of flame. But this was different. "Not a storm, child," she finally said, her voice low and reverent. "A god." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Around them, other villagers had begun to emerge from their homes, drawn by that same inexplicable sense of impending divine presence. Farmers abandoned their evening chores. Fishermen left their nets half-mended. Even the village priest, an elderly man named Takeshi, who served at the small Shinto shrine that stood at the center of Torigami, came hurrying down the stone steps from the sacred precinct, his white robes streaming behind him like banners in the strengthening wind. "Everyone inside," he called out, his usually calm voice edged with urgency. "Offer prayers to your household kami. Light incense. This is no ordinary storm." But even as the villagers scrambled to obey, hurrying back into their homes and sliding doors shut against the wind, they could not escape the feeling that something monumental was about to occur. That the very fabric of their ordinary lives was about to be torn aside like a paper screen, revealing something vast and terrible and divine. The thunder began then, not the familiar rumbling that announced normal storms, but a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a deep, resonating boom that shook the earth itself and rattled in the bones of every living creature in the valley. It rolled across the landscape like the war drums of heaven, proclaiming the arrival of something that transcended the mortal world. Lightning followed, but not in quick, bright flashes. Instead, her great jagged bolts tore across the sky, so brilliant that for moments the entire valley was illuminated in stark, colorless light that revealed every detail with unnatural clarity. In those frozen instants, the villagers could see the true nature of the storm approaching, could see that it was not merely weather, but wrath incarnate, fury given form and set loose upon the world. And in the heart of those clouds, though none of the mortals below could perceive it clearly, there walked a figure, a being of such immense power and turbulent emotion that his very presence distorted the natural order, bending wind and water and lightning to his will without conscious thought. A god in exile, a divine prince cast down from the celestial realm, a spirit so consumed with rage and grief and bitter resentment that he radiated discord like heat from a forge. His name was Susanoo-No-Mikoto, and he was coming to Izumo. But to understand why the storm god walked the mortal realm with such fury crackling in his wake, to comprehend the weight of divine judgment that had driven him from the heavenly realm of Takamagahara to wander the earth like a common exile, one must turn back the pages of time to events that had transpired in that high celestial court where the great kami held their eternal council. One must look to the moment when a god's pride shattered like pottery and a sister's love hardened into the necessity of punishment. One must witness the crimes that no amount of divine blood could excuse, and the banishment that followed as inevitably as thunder follows lightning. In the beginning, before shame knew his name, Susanoo-No-Mikoto was among the most glorious of all kami. Born from the divine father Izanagi's purification after his return from Yomi, the land of the dead, Susanoo emerged as one of 3 noble children who would shape the very structure of existence itself. His sister Amaterasu was gifted with dominion over the sun and the heavens, bringing light and order to the world. His brother Tsukuyomi received sovereignty over the moon and the night, governing the tides and the passage of time. And to Susanoo fell the vast expanse of the seas and oceans, the realm of storms and wild waters, where chaos and power merged in eternal dance. But Susanoo was not content. From his earliest moments of consciousness, he had been tempestuous, unpredictable, given to sudden rages and equally sudden periods of melancholy introspection. While Amaterasu ruled the heavenly plane of Takamagahara with grace and wisdom, ensuring harmony among the 8 million kami who dwelt there, and while Tsukuyomi maintained his quiet, measured oversight of night's domain, Susanoo chafed against the boundaries of his assigned realm. He longed to visit his mother Izanami, who had died giving birth to the fire god and descended to Yomi. This desire grew in him like a storm gathering strength, becoming an obsession that colored his every thought and action. He wept with such violence that his tears dried up rivers and withered forests. His tantrums shook the foundations of heaven itself, causing lesser kami to flee in terror when they sensed his approach. Amaterasu, who loved her brother despite his turbulent nature, tried repeatedly to soothe him, to guide him toward acceptance of his role and the natural order established by their father. She invited him to Takamagahara for a great council of reconciliation, hoping that if he spent time in the radiant halls of heaven, surrounded by order and beauty, his chaotic spirit might find some measure of peace. For a time, it seemed her plan might succeed. Susanoo arrived in Takamagahara with apparent humility, declaring that he wished only to bid farewell to his sister before descending to his ocean realm. He promised to cause no trouble, to respect the sanctity of the heavenly plane, to conduct himself with the dignity befitting one of the three noble children. But promises made in moments of calm are easily forgotten when the storm rises again. The troubles began small, almost unnoticeable. A sacred rice field trampled during one of Susanoo's restless walks. A channel between paddies destroyed by careless divine power. Amaterasu, seeking to preserve peace and understanding that her brother's nature was inherently chaotic, overlooked these minor transgressions. She ordered repairs made and said nothing, hoping that time would settle Susanoo's turbulent spirit. But time is not always a healer. Sometimes it merely provides space for small cracks to widen into great chasms. Susanoo's behavior grew worse. He began to deliberately destroy the rice fields that Amaterasu had cultivated with such care, the sacred crops that fed both gods and mortals. He broke down the divisions between fields, allowing the irrigation channels to flood and merge into muddy chaos. When confronted, he laughed and claimed it was an accident, that he had merely been testing the boundaries of his power, that surely his sister did not begrudge him such minor amusements. Amaterasu said nothing, but her light dimmed slightly with worry and sorrow. The other kami of heaven began to murmur among themselves. They gathered in small groups in the celestial gardens, speaking in low voices about the storm god's behavior. Some argued that he should be reprimanded, reminded of his place, and the respect due to Amaterasu's domain. Others, more cautious, suggested that direct confrontation with one as powerful and unpredictable as Susanoo might only make matters worse, that perhaps quiet diplomacy and patient guidance would eventually succeed where harsh words might fail. But before any consensus could be reached, before Amaterasu herself could decide on the best course of action, Susanoo committed an offense so grave that it could not be ignored, could not be explained away as accident or youthful exuberance. It happened during the celebration of the first harvest, when Amaterasu presided over the sacred weaving hall where divine garments were crafted from celestial thread. She sat among her attendants, goddesses of great beauty and skill, guiding their hands as they worked the looms that wove patterns of light and order into fabric that would clothe the kami and bless the mortal world below. The hall was a place of profound peace and sanctity, where the rhythmic clicking of looms created a meditation on harmony and creation. Sunlight streamed through high windows, making the threads shimmer like captured rainbows. An incense smoke rose in lazy spirals, carrying prayers to higher realms. It was, in many ways, the very heart of what Takamagahara represented: order, beauty, purpose, and divine grace working in perfect concert. Into this sanctuary of peace, Susanoo brought chaos. The storm god, drunk on sake and seething with resentment that he could not entirely name or understand, burst through the doors of the weaving hall with all the subtlety of a typhoon making landfall. His eyes blazed with divine fury. Thunder rumbled in his wake, and in his hands he carried something that made even his most loyal defenders recoil in horror. A flayed horse, a heavenly horse, one of the sacred mounts of the celestial realm, its hide stripped away to reveal the raw flesh beneath. Susanoo had killed it himself, and overcome by some dark impulse that he would never be able to fully explain. And now he hurled the carcass into the weaving hall as if it were some kind of twisted offering, some perverse gift to his sister. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The attendants screamed and fled. Sacred threads tangled and broke. One of the celestial maidens, struck by the horror of the desecration, fell backward in shock and was impaled on her own weaving shuttle, dying instantly from a wound that would have been nothing to a kami in any other circumstance. but the spiritual shock of such profound violation made even the immortal vulnerable. And Amaterasu, the sun goddess, the radiant one who had never known true darkness in all her existence, stared at her brother with an expression that transcended anger or disappointment. What showed on her perfect features was something far worse, a deep, profound grief, a sorrow so complete that it seemed to dim the very light she embodied. "Brother," she whispered, and in that single word lived the death of hope, the end of patience, the final severance of bonds that should have been eternal. "What have you become?" Susanoo had no answer. Or perhaps he had too many answers, all of them inadequate, all of them failing to explain why he had done something so terrible, so fundamentally wrong. He stood there in the doorway of the weaving hall, the aftermath of his actions spreading before him like blood in water, and for the first time in his existence, he felt something that might have been shame. But it was too late for shame, too late for apologies or explanations. The line had been crossed, the boundary violated in a way that could not be undone or overlooked. Amaterasu rose from her seat with terrible grace. Without another word to her brother, without even a glance in his direction, she walked from the weaving hall and made her way to a place that had been prepared for exactly this eventuality, though no one had ever truly believed it would be needed. A cave, a sacred cavern known as Ama-no-Iwato, the heavenly rock cave, where even the sun goddess could retreat from a world that had become too painful to illuminate. She entered the cave and rolled a massive boulder across its entrance, sealing herself away from heaven and earth alike. And with her departure, with her self-imposed exile, light itself began to die. Darkness fell across Takamagahara. Darkness fell across the mortal world below. Not the comfortable darkness of night, which had its own beauty and purpose under Tsukuyomi's care, but a cold, absolute darkness that held no promise of dawn. Plants began to wither. Mortals huddled in terror, burning what little firewood they had and praying desperately to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. The very structure of existence, which depended on the sun's illumination to maintain order and meaning, began to fray at the edges. The 8 million kami gathered in emergency council. They debated and argued, trying to devise some way to coax Amaterasu from her self-imposed exile. They held festivals and performances outside the cave, hoping to tempt her with music and celebration. The goddess Izumo performed an ecstatic dance that made all the assembled kami laugh with such genuine joy that Amaterasu, hearing the sound, grew curious enough to peek out from behind the boulder. When she did, the god Tajikarawo pulled the boulder fully away before she could retreat again, and Amaterasu was gently persuaded to return to her duties, to once more illuminate the world that so desperately needed her light. But the price of her return was steep and non-negotiable. The assembled kami, who had witnessed the storm god's crimes and seen the catastrophic results of his unchecked chaos, rendered their judgment with one voice. Susanoo-No-Mikoto was to be expelled from Takamagahara, stripped of his divine beard and fingernails in ritual humiliation, required to present 1,000 offering tables of tribute as recompense, and then cast down from the celestial realm to wander the mortal world as an exile, be forbidden to return until he had learned what it meant to be worthy of his divine heritage. The sentence was carried out with the cold efficiency that characterized divine justice. No amount of pleading or explanation would alter it. Susanoo's protests that he had not meant such harm, that his actions had been born of frustration and confusion rather than malice, fell on ears that had heard enough of his excuses. He was brought before Amaterasu one final time. She looked at him without anger, but also without warmth, as one might look at a stranger wearing a beloved face, someone who resembled a treasured sibling, but had somehow become someone else entirely. "Perhaps," she said softly, "in the world below, among mortals who must struggle for every moment of joy and peace, you will learn what we could not teach you here. Perhaps limitations will show you what infinite power has obscured." Then she turned away, and Susanoo-No-Mikoto, the storm god, the divine son of Izanagi, was cast down from heaven like rain driven before a harsh wind. The fall from Takamagahara was not the quick plummet one might imagine. It was a slow, agonizing descent through layers of reality, each one more solid and confining than the last. Susanoo felt his divine power diminishing with every moment, not vanishing entirely, but becoming muted, contained, forced into channels and boundaries that had never existed in the celestial realm. He fell through clouds that tore at him like accusing fingers, through layers of atmosphere that grew progressively heavier, thicker, laden with the smells and sensations of the mortal world, earth and water, growing things and dying things, the complex tapestry of life that the kami usually perceived only from vast, comfortable distances. When he finally struck the ground, it was in a forest in the province of Izumo, a place where ancient cedars grew so tall and thick that their canopy blocked out most of the sky. He lay there for a time, minutes or hours or days he could not tell, simply experiencing the strangeness of physical limitation, of gravity's pull, of cold earth against his body, and the sound of wind through branches rather than through the harmonious halls of heaven. Eventually, he rose. Thunder rumbled in his chest, an expression of the rage that still burned within him. How dare they cast him out? How dare Amaterasu, who had once been his closest companion, turn away from him with such cold finality? How dare the assembled kami judge him when they knew nothing of the frustration, the loneliness, the howling emptiness that had driven him to such extreme actions? He wanted to rage, to summon storms that would shake the very foundations of the world, to prove his power in ways that would force even heaven to take notice. Lightning danced between his fingers. The wind began to swirl around him in spiraling patterns of increasing intensity. Dark clouds gathered overhead, responding to his fury without conscious summoning. But as he stood there on the verge of unleashing devastation, something stopped him. A sound, faint but distinct even through the rising wind. A sound that cut through his divine tantrum with the sharp clarity of a blade through silk. Someone was crying. Susanoo froze, the storm around him stuttering and hesitating as his attention divided. He turned toward the sound, extending senses that had been focused entirely inward to now perceive the external world. The crying was coming from somewhere nearby, muffled by distance and the thick forest growth, but unmistakable in its genuine sorrow. Against his better judgment, against the voice in his mind that said he should simply unleash his power and let the mortals deal with the consequences, Susanoo found himself moving toward that sound. He pushed through undergrowth, his divine form still imposing enough that branches moved aside at his approach, creating a path where none had existed before. He emerged into a small clearing where a stream ran clear and cold over smooth stones. And there, sitting on the bank with her feet dangling in the water, was a child. She could not have been more than 5 or 6 summers old, small and fragile in the way that mortal children were, dressed in simple clothes that marked her as the daughter of a poor farming family. Her face was buried in her hands, and her small shoulders shook with the force of her weeping. Susanoo stood at the edge of the clearing, unsure what to do. He was a god. He had no experience with mortal children, no understanding of their needs or fears. His first impulse was to simply leave, to continue his wandering and let whatever tragedy had befallen this child resolve itself without his interference. But something held him there, some impulse he could not name, some faint stirring of something that might have been compassion or curiosity, or simply the desperate loneliness of an exile seeking any form of connection, even with a creature as insignificant as a mortal child. "Why do you cry?" he asked, his voice still carrying the resonance of divine power but tempered, softened almost instinctively to avoid frightening her further. The child startled, her head snapping up. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, her cheeks tracked with tears. For a moment, she simply stared at him, clearly trying to reconcile what she was seeing. A strange man, tall and imposing, with eyes that seemed to hold storms and skin that crackled faintly with residual divine power. "I'm lost," she finally said, her voice small and wavering. "I was gathering herbs with my mother, and I wandered away, and now I can't find her, and it's getting dark, and..." Her words dissolved into fresh sobs. Susanoo considered simply walking away. This was not his problem. He was a god in exile, cast down from heaven, nursing wounds both literal and metaphorical. He had no obligation to help a lost mortal child, no reason to involve himself in the small tragedies of the mortal world. But he found himself stepping closer instead, found himself kneeling beside the stream, bringing his eyes level with the child's. Up close, he could see the genuine terror in her expression, the vulnerability that came from being small and powerless in a world that suddenly seemed vast and hostile. It was a feeling, he realized with uncomfortable recognition, that he understood better now than he ever had before. "Where is your village?" he asked. She pointed vaguely toward the west, her hand shaking. "That way, I think. But everything looks the same, and I don't know how to find the path. And there might be wolves, and..." "There are no wolves," Susanoo interrupted, his voice carrying a certainty born of divine perception. He could sense every living creature within leagues, could feel the pulse of life that filled the forest around them. "I will take you home." He stood and extended his hand. The child hesitated for only a moment before taking it, her small fingers disappearing into his larger grip. Together they walked through the forest, Susanoo using his divine sense to navigate unerringly toward the collection of human life forces that marked a settlement. They walked in silence for a time, the child's crying gradually subsiding into occasional sniffles. Eventually, emboldened perhaps by the simple fact that she was no longer alone, she spoke again. "Are you a kami?" she asked, looking up at him with something between awe and uncertainty. Susanoo considered lying, or simply not answering. But something about the child's direct gaze, her willingness to trust him despite his obvious strangeness, made such deception feel beneath him. "Yes," he said simply. "Then why did you help me? Kami don't usually... the priests say they're very far away, and... Perhaps I am a different kind of kami than those your priests know," Susanoo said. Then, after a pause, he added quietly, "Perhaps I am learning to be." They continued walking, and Susanoo found himself studying the mortal world with new attention. He had passed through it before, of course, during his brief descents from heaven to walk upon the ocean's surface or summon storms. But he had never truly looked at it, never paid attention to the details that made it distinct from the celestial realm. Now he saw the way evening light filtered through leaves in shades of gold and green, heard the complex symphony of insect song that rose as darkness fell, felt the texture of earth beneath his feet, so different from the smooth perfection of heaven's floors. noticed how the child's hand was warm in his, pulsing with the quick heartbeat of mortal life. So rapid, so urgent, as if aware of how limited its time was, and determined to fill every moment with vibrant existence. When they finally emerged from the forest near the child's village, a group of adults came running toward them, led by a woman whose face was streaked with tears and tight with fear that transformed into overwhelming relief when she saw her daughter. "Yuki!" the woman cried, falling to her knees and pulling the child into a desperate embrace. "Oh, thank all the kami. I thought, I was so afraid. This man found me," the child said, pulling back from her mother's embrace to point at Susanoo. "He brought me home." The woman looked up at Susanoo, and he saw her expression shift as she took in his appearance, the aura of power that still clung to him, the eyes that reflected lightning, the unmistakable sense that she was looking at something that transcended mortal understanding. She prostrated herself on the ground, forehead pressed to the earth. "Lord Kami," she whispered, her voice trembling with reverence and fear. "Thank you. Thank you for returning my daughter. Please accept our humble—" "No offerings necessary," Susanoo interrupted, uncomfortable with the display. He had been so accustomed to receiving worship as his due in heaven, and had never questioned the prostrations of lesser kami before his power. But this was different. This gratitude was earned, not simply expected by virtue of his divine status. He started to turn away, to disappear back into the forest and continue his aimless wandering. But the woman called out to him, "Lord Kami, please, if there is anything we can do to show our gratitude, any service we can offer." Susanoo paused. He had no need of mortal offerings, no desire for the simple food or crude sake they might provide. But something made him turn back, made him look once more at the woman and her child, at the cluster of villagers who had gathered, and now stood watching him with expressions of hope and fear mixed in equal measure. "Tell me," he said slowly, "is there trouble in this land? Danger that your people face?" The villagers exchanged glances. Finally, an old man stepped forward, clearly someone of authority in the village, perhaps an elder or local leader. "Lord Kami," the old man said, bowing deeply, "we dare not trouble one such as yourself with our mortal concerns." "I asked," Susanoo said, his voice carrying enough power to make the statement impossible to ignore. "Answer." The old man straightened, meeting Susanoo's eyes with the kind of courage that comes only from desperation or long familiarity with death. "Yes, Lord. There is great danger. A monster terrorizes our land, demanding tribute that we can barely afford. Each year it comes, and each year we must give—" He faltered, his weathered face twisting with pain. "We must give what should never be asked." "What must you give?" Susanoo asked, and though something in the man's tone had already suggested the answer. "A maiden," the old man whispered. "Each year, on the night of the autumn moon, the creature comes to the river high, and we must send a young woman, dressed in white, to meet it. Those who go, they never return." Susanoo felt something stir within him, not the hot, chaotic rage that had driven his actions in heaven, but something colder and harder, something that might have been purpose. "Tell me about this creature," he said. And so, as night fell fully over the village and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky above, the exiled storm god sat among mortals and listened to their tale of terror, a tale of a beast that had haunted the province of Izumo for 8 years, claiming 8 maidens, and would soon demand a 9th. A tale of Yamata no Orochi in the 8-headed serpent and the approaching doom of the last daughter of the Ashinazuchi family. The river high was ancient, even by the standards of the kami who had watched the world's creation. It flowed down from the mountains of Izumo, through dense forests and fertile valleys, fed by countless tributaries that merged like veins converging toward a heart. The river's waters ran clear and cold even in summer, carrying the mineral taste of deep stone and the memory of snow from high peaks. But there was another quality to the river high now, something that had not been there before the serpent came, a sense of unease that rippled through the water like an infection, making animals avoid drinking from its banks and fish swim nervously in its depths. The locals whispered that the river itself had begun to run darker in recent years, as if the blood of the serpent's victims had stained it permanently, seeping into its very essence. Susanoo walked beside this river in the gray light of early morning, following its course upstream toward the place where the old man had indicated the beast made its lair. The storm god moved with purpose now, his aimless wandering replaced by something that felt almost like direction. He was not certain when or why his perspective had shifted, could not identify the exact moment when the mortal's plight had become something he cared about, rather than simply another feature of the world that did not concern him. Perhaps it had been the child's tears, perhaps the mother's desperate gratitude, perhaps simply the weight of exile pressing down upon him, making him desperate for any form of redemption, in any way to prove that he was more than the chaos bringer that heaven had condemned. Or perhaps, and this thought disturbed him in ways he could not fully articulate, perhaps it was that he finally understood what it meant to be afraid, to be powerless before something greater, to stand at the mercy of forces beyond one's control and wait for judgment that might be cruel or kind, based on nothing but arbitrary whim. He had been that force once. He had reveled in his power, used it carelessly, assumed that strength gave him the right to do as he pleased. But exile had taught him what it felt like to be on the other side of that equation, to be the one cast down and subject to the will of others. And he found he did not like it at all. The terrain grew rougher as Susanoo followed the river higher into the mountains. The forest changed from the mixed hardwoods of the lowlands to stands of dark pine and twisted cedar, their branches heavy with moss and their roots grasping at rocky soil. The air grew thinner, colder, carrying the sharp scent of high altitude and ancient stone. And gradually, as he climbed, Susanoo began to sense something else. A presence that made the hair on his arms stand on end, that set his divine senses screaming warnings he could not quite interpret. It was like the feeling before a massive storm breaks, when the air becomes thick and heavy and charged with potential violence. But this was worse, darker, touched with a malevolence that transcended simple natural fury. This was not a force of nature. This was a predator, a killer, something that took genuine pleasure in the terror it inspired and the lives it consumed. Yamata no Orochi. Susanoo had heard the mortals' descriptions, of course. They spoke of a serpent the size of 8 valleys, with 8 heads and 8 tails, each one independent, yet somehow part of a unified whole. They described eyes like blood-red pools and scales that gleamed like metal. They told of the creature's approach being heralded by the stench of death and the withering of all living things in its path. But descriptions, Susanoo was learning, were pale shadows of actual experience. And as he rounded a bend in the river and caught his first true glimpse of the serpent's territory, he understood why 8 years of mortal tribute had not sated its hunger, why no hero had succeeded in slaying it, why the people of Izumo lived in such absolute terror. The landscape itself was dead. For perhaps half a league in every direction from a massive cave that gaped in the mountainside like a wound in the earth, nothing lived. The trees were skeletal husks their bark stripped away and their branches raised toward the sky in attitudes of frozen agony. The ground was bare stone and ash, cracked and broken, as if some terrible heat had split it from within. Even the river, which flowed past the edge of this dead zone, seemed to move more quickly here, as if eager to escape contamination. And from the cave came a smell that made even Susanoo's divine constitution recoil. It was the reek of decay magnified 1,000-fold, mixed with something acrid and chemical, like burning metal. It was the smell of death, not as a natural transition, but as a violation, as if the very concept of life had been deliberately and maliciously corrupted. Susanoo stood at the boundary of the dead zone and extended his senses, trying to perceive what lay within that cave. What he felt made him go very still. Power. Vast, ancient, wrong. Not divine power like his own, which derived from celestial heritage and flowed according to certain natural laws. This was something older and darker, something that had existed before the current order of the world had been established. Primordial chaos given form and hunger, a fragment of the original void that had resisted all attempts to bind it within meaning or purpose. And it was old. By all the gods, it was old. Susanoo could sense the weight of years pressing down upon that presence like layers of sediment burying a stone. Centuries, at least. Perhaps millennia. How long had this creature haunted these mountains, and how many lives had it consumed before the mortals had learned to appease it with tribute? For the first time since accepting this quest, Susanoo felt something that might have been doubt. He was powerful, yes. He was a god, one of the 3 noble children, born from the Divine Father's purification. He commanded storms and seas, could call lightning from clear skies and summon winds that could tear stone from the earth. But he was also in exile, diminished, cut off from the full measure of his power, forbidden from drawing upon the inexhaustible well of celestial energy that Takamagahara represented. He was still formidable by mortal standards, still capable of feats that would seem miraculous to human observers. But was he capable of facing something like this? Something that had existed when the world was young and showed no sign of weakening despite the passage of ages? He did not know. And the uncertainty was terrifying in a way that nothing in his existence had prepared him for. Susanoo turned away from the cave and made his way back down the mountain, his mind churning. He needed information. He needed to understand not just what the serpent was, but how it hunted, how it thought, what patterns governed its behavior. No amount of raw power would avail him if he charged blindly into confrontation with something this ancient and malevolent. He needed to speak with someone who had been observing the serpent for years, someone who had studied its patterns out of desperate necessity, someone who had lost more than anyone to this creature's hunger. He needed to meet the family Ashinazuchi. The Ashinazuchi household sat in a valley some leagues downstream from the serpent's lair, positioned as if in deliberate defiance of the monster that haunted the mountains above. It was a modest estate by the standards of mortal nobility, a main house of weathered wood and tile, surrounded by carefully tended fields and a small garden that showed signs of loving but melancholic care. Susanoo approached as evening was settling over the valley, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. He could see figures moving within the house, shadows passing behind paper screens. Could hear the murmur of voices engaged in conversation that carried the particular quality of people speaking of terrible things with forced calm. He announced himself at the gate in the traditional manner, and after a moment's hesitation, an old man appeared from the house. He was perhaps 60 summers, with hair gone completely white and a face that wore the tracks of years and sorrow in deep lines. He wore the simple clothes of a country lord. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that spoke of great wealth or power. This, then, was Ashinazuchi, the father who had watched 7 daughters walk to their deaths, and who would soon send an 8th. "You are the kami who helped the child in the forest," Ashinazuchi said. It was not quite a question. News traveled fast in rural communities, and Susanoo's appearance and actions would have been discussed in every home within the region by now. "I am," Susanoo confirmed. "My name is Susanoo-No-Mikoto." He saw recognition flare in the old man's eyes. Even in this remote province, the name of the storm god was known. And Susanoo waited for fear, for prostration, for the usual mortal response to divine presence. But Ashinazuchi merely bowed with courteous respect and said, "Then you are most welcome in my home, Lord Susanoo. Though I fear we have little to offer a guest of your stature." "I require no hospitality," Susanoo said. "I have come to speak with you about the serpent and your daughter." The old man's face, already marked with sorrow, seemed to age another decade in an instant. He gestured toward the house. "Then please come inside, though I warn you, it is not a pleasant tale." The interior of the house was as modest as its exterior, but clean and well-maintained. Susanoo was led to a main room where tatami mats covered the floor and a low table sat surrounded by cushions. An old woman, Ashinazuchi's wife, clearly, unbearing the same weight of sorrow in her lined face, knelt beside a hearth where a small fire burned, and seated across from her, helping to prepare the evening meal with mechanical precision, was a young woman who could only be the daughter. The last daughter, the 9th offering. Susanoo found himself staring. She was perhaps 20 summers, with long black hair bound simply at the nape of her neck, and a face that bore the quiet beauty of someone who had never sought to emphasize or exploit her appearance. She wore a simple indigo kimono, and her hands as she worked showed the calluses of someone accustomed to labor. But it was her eyes that struck him most forcefully. They held a quality he had seen before, but never truly understood until this moment. The look of someone who had already accepted death, who had made peace with mortality in a way that allowed them to continue functioning, but had stolen something essential from their spirit. "This is our daughter," Ashinazuchi said quietly. "Kushinada Hime." The young woman looked up at Susanoo's entrance and bowed politely, showing no particular reaction to his obvious divine nature. "Welcome, Lord Kami," she said, her voice soft but steady. "She is to be the serpent's tribute?" Susanoo asked, though he already knew the answer. "In 7 days," Ashinazuchi confirmed, "on the night of the autumn moon." "Tell me everything," Susanoo commanded, settling himself on a cushion. "Tell me about the serpent, about the tributes, about every detail you have observed. Leave nothing out, no matter how small it seems." And so, as night fell fully and stars emerged in the sky beyond the paper screens, the Ashinazuchi family told their tale. 8 years ago, they explained, the serpent had first appeared in the mountains above the river high. There had been no warning, no legend or prophecy to prepare them. One day the mountains had been as they had always been, home to deer and wild boar and the occasional bear. The next, a vast dead zone had appeared overnight, and from its center had come a creature from nightmare. The serpent had descended from its cave on the night of the first autumn moon, moving with terrible purpose down the mountainside toward the inhabited valleys below. Those who had seen it described 8 massive heads, each the size of a house, moving independently yet somehow in perfect coordination, and they spoke of scales that shifted color between green and black and oily purple. of eyes that glowed like coals, of breath that withered crops and made animals flee in mindless terror. The creature had entered the first village it found, a small collection of perhaps 50 houses beside the river, and had begun to systematically destroy it. Not with fire or storm, but with more deliberate cruelty. It had torn homes apart beam by beam, had pursued fleeing villagers with something that looked almost like playfulness, the way a cat might toy with a mouse before killing it. By the time warriors from nearby settlements had arrived, drawn by the smoke and screams, the village was gone. Every building reduced to splinters, every man, woman, and child dead, their bodies scattered across the landscape in attitudes of terror. And the warriors had attacked, of course. They were brave men, trained in combat, willing to face death to protect their people. They had brought spears and swords and arrows, had fought with all the skill and courage that mortal men possessed. It had not been enough, not even close. The serpent had killed them almost casually, its 8 heads striking like battering rams, its coils crushing armor and bone with equal ease. In less than an hour, 24 warriors lay dead, and the serpent showed no sign of injury despite the countless weapons that had struck its scales. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature had simply stopped. It had raised its 8 heads toward the sky and made a sound, not quite a roar, not quite speech, but something that carried meaning despite lacking words. A demand, an ultimatum. The priests had interpreted it, translating the serpent's intent through divination and desperate prayer. The creature wanted tribute. One maiden, unmarried and pure, delivered to the riverside on the night of each autumn moon. In exchange, it would retreat to its mountain lair and leave the mortal settlements unmolested. Refuse, and it would destroy every village in Izumo, one by one, until the land ran red with blood and no human dared walk beneath these skies. We had no choice, Ashinazuchi said, his voice hollow with old pain. One life against thousands, one daughter's death against the annihilation of our people. How could we refuse? That first year, a maiden from the destroyed village's survivors had been chosen, or had volunteered. Accounts varied. She had been dressed in white, the color of death and mourning, and led to the riverside as the autumn moon rose. The serpent had descended from its lair, had taken her in one of its terrible mouths, and had retreated back to the mountains. And Izumo had been spared. For 1 year. But the next autumn, the demand had come again. Another maiden required. Another life traded for temporary peace. And so a lottery had been instituted, a terrible tradition, where every family with an eligible daughter entered their names, and divine lots were drawn to select who would fulfill the tribute. The first year, the lot fell to a family from the northern settlements, Ashinazuchi continued. The second year to the west, the third, the fourth, the fifth. He paused, his hands clenching into fists. 6 years, Lord Susanoo. 6 times other families sent their daughters to die. 6 times we watched in horror and guilt and terrible relief that it was not our turn. And then the 7th year, his wife said softly, speaking for the first time. Her voice was thin as paper, stretched to breaking. The lot fell to us, to our eldest, Miho. Susanoo saw Kushinada Jaime flinch at her sister's name, though she said nothing. She was 17, the mother continued. Beautiful and kind, skilled in weaving and song. She had been teaching the village children their letters. She had... The woman's voice broke. She had a young man who wanted to marry her. They had been planning their life together. But the lot had spoken, Ashinazuchi said. And so we dressed Miho in white and walked her to the riverside. and watched as the serpent came down from the mountains and... He could not finish the sentence. On the next year, Kusanada said, her voice quiet but steady, taking up the narrative when her parents could not. The lot fell to us again. Our second daughter, Yai, and the year after, Saori, and the year after that, Kinu, and then Tamaki, and then Hana, and then Sachi. 7 names, 7 daughters. 7 times this family had walked to the riverside and given up their children to a monster's hunger. We had 9 daughters, Ashinazuchi whispered. 9 beautiful, perfect daughters. When they were young, this house rang with their laughter. They would race through the gardens, play games with visiting children, sing together in the evenings. And now... He looked around the quiet house, and Susanoo understood. The silence here was not peaceful. It was the silence of a tomb, of a place where joy had died and been replaced by something worse than simple grief, by guilt and helplessness and the terrible knowledge that no matter how much they mourned, they would have to sacrifice again. Why has the lot fallen to your house so many times? Susanoo asked. Pure chance. At first, perhaps, Ashinazuchi said, but after the 3rd year, I began to suspect. Lord Susanoo, I am not an important man. I am a minor lord, with no great wealth or powerful connections. And there are families in Izumo who are wealthy, who have influence over the priests who draw the lots. You think the lottery has been manipulated, Susanoo said. It was not quite a question. I know it has been, Ashinazuchi said with quiet certainty. I cannot prove it. But 7 years in a row? When there are dozens of eligible families? On the mathematics alone. He shook his head. It does not matter. Proof or no proof, the result is the same. In 7 days, my last daughter will walk to the riverside, and I will have no children left. Father, please, Kusanada said softly, laying a hand on the old man's arm. Do not torture yourself. What will be, will be. You accept this? Susanoo asked her directly, his voice sharper than he intended. You will go willingly to your death? She met his eyes, and in her gaze he saw that terrible acceptance again. That quality of someone who had already left the world, even while their body remained in it. What choice do I have, Lord Kami? If I refuse, the serpent will destroy everything. Everyone. All the people of Izumo will die because I valued my own life above theirs. How could I live with that knowledge? How could I look my parents in the eyes, knowing I chose cowardice when my sisters had been brave? Bravery, Susanoo said, and there was something almost like anger in his voice now. Should not be measured by willingness to die needlessly. Needlessly? Kusanada's voice hardened slightly. My death will save thousands. That is not needless. It is needless, Susanoo insisted, if the serpent can be stopped. Silence fell over the room. The family stared at him with expressions ranging from confusion to desperate, fragile hope. What are you saying? Ashinazuchi finally asked. Susanoo stood, his decision crystallizing in that moment. I am saying that I will kill the serpent, that Kusanada will not die in 7 days, that the tribute ends now. The hope in their faces warred with disbelief. Lord Susanoo, Ashinazuchi said carefully, you honor us with your intent, but you must understand, others have tried. Warriors, heroes, even kami of lesser rank, all have failed. The serpent is... I know what it is, Susanoo interrupted. I have sensed its presence. I understand its power. He paused, then added with grim certainty, and I will kill it regardless. How? Kusanada asked, not challenging but genuinely curious, as if trying to comprehend something that transcended her ability to hope. Susanoo smiled. and it was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who had glimpsed a plan forming in the chaos of possibility, who had seen a way to use his nature, the very tempestuousness that had gotten him exiled from heaven, as a weapon. "Tell me," he said, "does the serpent have any known weaknesses, any pattern to its behavior? Does it ever seem diminished or vulnerable?" The family exchanged glances. "After it feeds," Kushinada Himi's mother said slowly, "when it takes the tribute, the priests say that for several days after, it remains in its cave, that it seems lethargic, perhaps." "It gorges itself and then rests," Susanoo murmured, his mind racing. "Like a snake after a large meal. The digestion makes it slow, vulnerable." "But only for a few days," Ashinazuchi warned. "And even then, approaching the cave would be—" "I am not concerned with approaching the cave," Susanoo said. He began to pace, energy crackling around him as his divine nature responded to his rising excitement. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, as if the sky itself was responding to his thoughts. "I want to draw it out. Make it come to us. Odd to a place and time of our choosing." "How?" Kushinada Hime asked again. Susanoo turned to her, and his expression was fierce. "By offering it exactly what it expects, a maiden at the riverside on the night of the autumn moon. But instead of sending you to your death, we will use that expectation as bait. The serpent will come. They always do what they've done before, these old monsters. They cannot imagine the patterns of their existence changing. And when it does, I will be waiting." "And then?" Ashinazuchi asked. "And then," Susanoo said grimly, "we will see if an ancient serpent can withstand the wrath of a storm god with something to prove." The next 7 days passed in a flurry of preparation. Susanoo threw himself into planning with an intensity that surprised even him. He found that having a clear purpose, in a specific goal beyond simply wandering in exile or raging against the unfairness of his banishment, gave his existence a structure it had previously lacked. He studied the terrain around the riverside where the tribute was traditionally left, looking for advantages he could exploit. He observed the weather patterns, trying to determine what conditions would be most favorable for the kind of storm he wanted to summon. He spoke with every person in the surrounding villages who had witnessed the serpent's approach, gathering details about its movement, its behavior, its seeming invulnerability to conventional weapons. And gradually, a plan formed. Not a simple plan. Nothing about facing a creature like Yamada no Orochi could be simple, but one that played to Susanoo's strengths, while accounting for the serpent's power. The key, he realized, was not to try to match the creature's brute force directly. Yes, he was a god, but he was also diminished by exile, cut off from the full measure of his power. And the serpent was ancient, fueled by primordial chaos that predated the current order of things. No, what Susanoo needed to do was be smarter, use cunning, employ tactics rather than simply trading blow for blow. He remembered a conversation with his sister Amaterasu from before everything had gone so terribly wrong. She had been explaining some aspect of her divine duties, and she had said something that had seemed unimportant at the time, but now returned to him with the clarity of prophecy. Power is nothing without wisdom, brother, and the greatest wisdom is knowing that not every battle must be won through strength alone. At the time, he had dismissed her words as typical Amaterasu philosophy. Pretty sounding, but ultimately irrelevant to someone like him, who embodied raw, elemental force. But now, in exile, faced with a foe that might actually surpass his strength, he was beginning to understand what she had meant. 5 days before the autumn moon, Susanoo made a journey to several nearby settlements and collected something specific: sake. Not just any sake, but the finest, strongest rice wine that mortal brewers could create. He gathered 8 massive containers, each one large enough to require 3 strong men to move when full. "What are you planning?" Kushinada-hime asked, watching as these containers were transported to the riverside and positioned at specific points Susanoo had marked out. "An old trick," Susanoo said, based on a simple observation. Most creatures, when they find something they want, cannot resist taking it, even if caution would suggest otherwise. He did not elaborate further, but Kushinada-hime was intelligent enough to draw conclusions. "You mean to drug it?" "In a manner of speaking. The serpent has 8 heads, each presumably with its own mouth and throat. 8 containers of sake, positioned exactly where those heads will reach when it approaches the tribute site. It will smell the alcohol, and if it is anything like other reptilian creatures, the scent will trigger feeding behavior. And if it drinks all 8 containers, then even a monster will find its reaction slowed, its coordination impaired. And that may be all the advantage I need." 3 days before the autumn moon, Susanoo had a long, our private conversation with Kushinada-hime. They walked together beside the river high, upstream from where the tribute would be left, away from the ears of family or curious villagers. "You do not have to do this," she said quietly. "You have already given us more than we could have hoped simply by trying. If you fall against the serpent, no one will think less of you." "I will not fall," Susanoo said with more confidence than he felt. "You cannot know that." "No," he admitted, "but I can choose to believe it. And sometimes that is enough." They walked in silence for a time, listening to the river's song and the rustle of wind through the trees. Finally, Kushinada-hime spoke again. "Why are you doing this? Truly, you are a god in exile, and with no obligation to mortals, and certainly no requirement to risk yourself for a family you barely know. Why?" Susanoo considered the question carefully. It deserved an honest answer, and finding that honesty within himself was harder than he expected. "Because," he finally said, "I need to know if I can be more than what heaven deemed me. Because I need to prove, to myself, perhaps more than to anyone else, that I am capable of something beyond destruction and chaos. Because..." He paused, struggling with words that felt too vulnerable, too revealing. "Because you accepted death with dignity, and your family bore unimaginable grief with grace, and I have never known how to do either of those things. You showed me courage I did not possess, and that shames me in ways I cannot fully articulate." She looked at him with surprise. "You, a god, speak of being shamed by mortals? Perhaps that is the lesson exile was meant to teach me," Susanoo said. "That divinity does not equal wisdom. That power does not equal worth. That there are forms of strength that have nothing to do with the ability to command storms or shake mountains." Kushinada-hime was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "If you defeat the serpent, when you defeat the serpent, what will you do then?" "I do not know," Susanoo admitted. "Return to my wandering, I suppose. Seek whatever redemption heaven might eventually grant. Try to learn what it means to be worthy of the power I was born with." "You could stay," she said. And there was something in her voice that made him stop walking and turn to look at her fully. "In Izumo, I mean. If you wished, my family would welcome you. The people would revere you. You would have a place." He studied her face, seeing something there that was both offering and question, both hope and fear of rejection. And he realized with a start that somewhere in these past days, something had shifted between them. She no longer looked at him with the distant acceptance of someone already dead. and he no longer looked at her as simply a mortal to be saved. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should worry about surviving the serpent before discussing what comes after. She smiled faintly. That seems practical. I have recently learned the value of practicality, Susanoo said with matching lightness. Then, more seriously, thank you, Kushinada Jaime, for showing me that mortality is not the weakness I believed it to be, for demonstrating that accepting limitation can be its own kind of strength. And thank you, she replied, for showing me that death need not be accepted when there are still those who would fight for life. The night of the autumn moon arrived with the inevitability of seasons turning. The sky was clear, stars visible in brilliant profusion, and the moon rose full and golden over the mountains, casting the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. At the riverside where 7 maidens had walked to their deaths, preparations were complete. The 8 containers of sake sat in a precise circle, positioned exactly where Susanoo's divine senses suggested the serpent's 8 heads would reach. Each container had been left open, allowing the potent alcoholic scent to drift on the night breeze, carrying upstream toward the mountains where the creature made its lair. And in the center of that circle, dressed in white as tradition demanded, stood a figure that appeared to be Kushinada Hime. In reality, it was an elaborate construction, a wooden frame and rice straw body dressed in the maiden's clothes, designed to present the correct silhouette from a distance while containing none of the vulnerability of actual human flesh. The real Kushinada Jaime stood with Susanoo some 100 yards downstream, concealed by a small grove of trees. Her parents had wanted to be present as well, but Susanoo had forbidden it. What was about to happen would be dangerous in ways that mortals could not survive, and he would not have more deaths on his conscience if the battle went poorly. How long must we wait? Kushinada Jaime whispered, her voice tight with tension. Not long, Susanoo replied. He could feel it now, a disturbance in the natural order, a wrongness approaching from the mountains like a stain spreading across clean fabric. It knows the tribute has been left. It is coming. And indeed, within moments, they heard it. A sound like trees being crushed underfoot, like earth being torn and stone being ground to powder. The serpent was descending from its mountain lair, moving with terrible purpose toward the riverside. The sound grew louder, closer, and then, at the edge of the clearing where the false tribute stood, the forest itself seemed to split apart as Yamata no Orochi emerged into the moonlight. Susanoo had thought himself prepared for the sight. He had questioned witnesses, gathered descriptions, built a mental image of what he would face. But nothing could have truly prepared him for the reality of the creature before him now. It was not merely large. Large implied comprehensibility, a scale that could be measured and understood. This was beyond that. The serpent's body was a mountain of scaled flesh, coiling and uncoiling as it moved, each section as thick as the greatest trees in the forest. And from this body rose 8 necks, each one extending perhaps 40 feet, each topped with a head the size of a house. The heads moved independently, but with terrible coordination, like the fingers of a single massive hand. They swayed as the serpent approached, their movements almost hypnotic. Each head was slightly different, one with more pronounced fangs, another with eyes set wider apart, a third with scales that seemed to shimmer with oily rainbow colors. Yet all shared certain characteristics. Eyes that glowed with baleful red light, mouths that dripped venom which sizzled and smoked where it touched the ground, and an aura of wrongness so profound that simply looking at the creature made Susanoo's divine senses recoil. Beside him, Kushinada Hime made a small, choked sound of terror. Susanoo could not blame her. He was a god, had faced the fury of his peers in heaven, had weathered divine judgment and celestial exile, and even he felt fear coiling in his chest like ice at the sight of this thing that should not exist, this fragment of chaos that had somehow persisted when the world was shaped into order. The serpent approached the tribute site, its 8 heads reaching the circle of sake containers, while its body remained at the clearing's edge. For a moment, all 8 heads paused, unswaying slightly, as if confused by the unexpected scent. Then, exactly as Susanoo had hoped, feeding instinct overrode caution. The heads descended toward the sake containers, each one choosing a different vessel. The serpent began to drink. Susanoo watched with fierce attention, monitoring the creature's consumption. 1 container emptied, then 2, then 4. The serpent showed no sign of stopping, its 8 mouths working independently to drain the sake as if it were water. 8 containers, 8 heads, all the sake consumed. For a long moment, nothing changed. The serpent's heads rose from the empty containers, swaying once more, and Susanoo felt his heart sink. Had it not been enough? Was the creature's metabolism so vast that even that massive amount of alcohol was insufficient to affect it? But then he saw it. A slight loss of coordination in the head's movement. One of them swayed too far to the left and bumped against another. A third dipped lower than it should, almost touching the ground before correcting. The serpent's body, which had been tense and ready, began to relax slightly, its coils loosening. It was working. The sake was affecting the creature, slowing its reactions, dulling the coordination that made it such a devastating predator. "Now," Susanoo said quietly to Kushinada-hime, "get back to the village. Run and do not look back no matter what you hear." "But now!" His voice carried divine command, impossible to disobey. She fled, racing back through the forest towards safety, and Susanoo stepped out into the clearing, divine power crackling around him like a cloak of lightning, and the time for planning was over. Now came the storm. The serpent sensed him immediately. All 8 heads whipped around to fix him with their baleful gazes, momentary confusion giving way to unmistakable rage. This was not the tribute it had expected. This was something else, something that dared to challenge rather than submit. Yamata no Orochi roared, a sound that came from all 8 mouths simultaneously, a cacophony so overwhelming that trees bent away from it and the river's water actually rippled backward, momentarily reversing its flow. The creature's body tensed, coils shifting as it prepared to strike. Susanoo raised his hands to the sky and called the storm. It answered. Oh, how it answered. Clouds materialized from clear air, boiling up from nothing in defiance of natural law. Within seconds, the moon was obscured. The stars vanished, and the night became darkness absolute. Wind howled through the clearing with the force of a hurricane, bending the remaining trees until they screamed in protest. And then, the lightning came, not in single bolts, but in a cascade, a waterfall of electricity that turned night into something brighter than day. Bolt after bolt hammered down from the roiling clouds, each one targeting the serpent with divine precision. They struck the creature's scales, its heads, its body, illuminating the battlefield in stark flashes of white and purple light. The serpent thrashed, its head striking out blindly, its body coiling and uncoiling in apparent agony. But whether the lightning actually hurt it or simply enraged it further, Susanoo could not tell. The scales seemed to conduct some of the electricity away, on dispersing it into the ground, and while the creature's movements had lost some coordination thanks to the sake, it was far from helpless. One of the heads lunged toward Susanoo with terrifying speed, jaws gaping to reveal fangs the length of swords. He dodged, but barely, feeling the wind of the serpent's passage and catching a whiff of its breath, a smell like rot and acid and things that should not be. Another head struck from a different angle, then a third, then a fourth. The serpent's 8 heads attacked with brutal efficiency, each one independent yet somehow acting in concert, covering every possible avenue of escape. Susanoo called wind to carry him above the strikes, lifted himself on currents of air that responded to his will as naturally as breathing. From this elevated position, he hurled bolt after bolt of lightning down at the creature, targeting the heads specifically now, trying to blind those terrible red eyes. But the serpent was learning. One of its heads caught him with a glancing blow, sending him tumbling through the air to crash into the trees at the clearing's edge. Pain exploded through his divine form, not the worst he had ever experienced, but shocking in its intensity. When was the last time something had actually hurt him? He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the way his body protested, and summoned more lightning. The clearing was a maelstrom now, a chaos of wind and electricity, and the serpent's thrashing coils. The ground itself was being torn up, trees uprooted, the river diverted from its banks by the violence of their battle. And Susanoo began to realize with cold certainty that he was not winning. He was fighting to a standstill at best, and the storm he had summoned, powerful as it was, drew heavily on his diminished reserves. He could not maintain this level of intensity indefinitely. Eventually, he would exhaust himself, and when that happened, the serpent would kill him with contemptuous ease. He needed a different approach. Not storm, not lightning, not the raw elemental force that was his nature. He needed to be smarter. Susanoo landed on the serpent's back, between 2 of its coils, and drew forth a weapon he had not used in years, a sword of divine metal that he had carried since his creation, a blade that held an edge that could cut through anything mortal and most things divine. He drove the sword deep into the serpent's flesh, and between 2 scales where a gap in its armor showed. The blade sank to the hilt, and for the first time, Yamata no Orochi made a sound that was unmistakably pain. The creature bucked, trying to throw him off. He held on, twisting the blade, driving it deeper. Black blood welled up around the wound, thick and reeking of poison. Where it touched Susanoo's skin, it burned, but he ignored the pain and pulled the sword free only to drive it in again and again, working his way along the serpent's body like a woodsman felling a massive tree. The heads were trying to reach him now, bending back at impossible angles to strike at this annoying parasite on their body. But Susanoo moved with divine speed, always staying just ahead of those snapping jaws, always finding another gap in the scales, another place to drive his blade home. And slowly, on with agonizing effort, he began to do real damage. The serpent's movements grew more desperate, more uncoordinated. Whether this was the continued effect of the sake or simply the result of pain and blood loss, Susanoo neither knew nor cared. He just kept striking, kept cutting, moving along the creature's length with methodical precision. He was working his way toward the serpent's tails now, targeting the base where tail met body, trying to sever the connections that allowed this monster to move with such deadly efficiency. His sword rose and fell, each strike precise and devastating. And then, on what must have been his 100th strike, or perhaps his 1000th, time had lost meaning in the fury of battle. His blade struck something different. Not flesh, not bone, but something that rang like metal, something that resisted even his divine weapon, something that glowed faintly in the darkness, visible even through the serpent's flesh. Susanoo paused, his battle-heightened senses focusing on that strange resistance. He could feel it now, a concentration of power unlike anything else in the serpent's body. Not chaotic or wrong like the creature itself, but orderly, harmonious, divine. There was something inside the serpent, something it had swallowed long ago, something that had never been digested, but instead remained whole and intact within its body. Susanoo cut deeper, carving through layers of flesh and muscle, following that strange resonance like a lodestone following true north. The serpent thrashed more violently now, as if aware on some instinctive level that he was close to something important. And then his blade cut through one final layer of flesh, and something tumbled free from the wound. A sword. Not his sword, but another blade. Ancient, beautiful, glowing with an inner light that seemed to drive back the darkness of the storm. It landed on the ground at the base of one of the serpent's tails, and even lying in the dirt, it was magnificent. Kusanagi-no-Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword. One of the 3 legendary treasures of the imperial line, lost for generations, presumed destroyed or stolen by demons, and it had been here all along, inside the belly of a monster, waiting for someone to free it. Susanoo stared at the sword for a heartbeat, comprehension flooding through him. This was divine craftsmanship, a blade forged by celestial artisans for purposes beyond his understanding. And it called to him now, resonating with his own divine nature, begging to be wielded by hands that could appreciate its true potential. He released his own sword. It vanished back into the nowhere space from which he had drawn it, and reached for Kusanagi instead. His fingers closed around the hilt, and power surged through him. Not his power, but the blades, amplifying and focusing his remaining strength into something pure and devastating. Susanoo rose to his full height atop the serpent's thrashing body. He raised Kusanagi above his head, and lightning, not called by him, but drawn by the sword itself, struck the blade and flowed through it, turning the weapon into a spear of pure divine fury. "Enough!" Susanoo said, his voice carrying the weight of command that no mortal or monster could resist. "This ends." He drove Kusanagi down into the serpent's body with all his remaining strength, channeling every scrap of divine power he still possessed through the blade. The sword sank deep, deeper than should have been possible, piercing through flesh and bone and muscle, driving all the way to the creature's heart, or whatever served as a heart in this abomination's twisted anatomy. Yamata no Orochi screamed. All 8 heads threw themselves back and roared in perfect unison, a sound that shattered what few trees remained standing around the clearing. The creature's body convulsed, coils tightening and loosening in rapid succession, tails lashing with enough force to carve channels in the earth. And then, with a final shudder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world, the serpent collapsed. Its 8 heads fell to the ground, their red eyes dimming and finally going dark. Its massive body went limp, no longer a mountain of living terror, but simply meat and scale and cooling blood. The wrongness that had emanated from it, that sense of chaos and malevolence, began to dissipate like morning mist. Susanoo stood atop the corpse, still gripping Kusanagi, breathing hard. The storm he had summoned was already beginning to break apart, clouds dissipating as his will no longer held them together. Lightning flashed once more, twice, then fell silent. Rain began to fall, gentle rather than violent, washing the blood and poison from the battlefield. He had won. Against all probability, despite his diminished state, with only cunning and determination and the fortuitous discovery of a legendary sword, he had defeated Yamata no Orochi. And standing there in the rain, with a monster's corpse beneath his feet, and dawn beginning to break on the eastern horizon. Susanoo-No-Mikoto felt something he had not experienced in so long, he had almost forgotten its name. He felt pride, not the shallow, arrogant pride that had characterized his actions in heaven, but genuine pride in accomplishment, in victory earned through effort rather than simply assumed through divine right. He had done this. He had protected innocence. He had ended a reign of terror. He had proven, if only to himself, that he could be more than chaos and destruction. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was worth all the pain of exile. The sun rose over Izumo province on a world transformed. The dead zone around the Serpent's cave was already showing signs of life returning. Small plants pushing up through the poisoned earth. Birds tentatively exploring branches that had been skeletal just hours before. The river high ran clear again, its waters no longer carrying that undertaste of death and corruption. And at the riverside where 8 maidens had died, the people of Izumo gathered to see the impossible. The corpse of Yamata no Orochi lying still and silent in the morning light and standing before it. A god who had kept his promise. Susanoo had remained at the battlefield throughout the night, partly from exhaustion and partly from a strange reluctance to leave. He had pulled Kusanagi free from the serpent's body and stood guard over the corpse, half expecting the creature to somehow rise again and to reveal that this victory was illusion. But as dawn broke and the first villagers began to appear, summoned by Kushinada Haim, who had returned to tell them of the battle, he finally accepted that it was truly over. The people approached with caution at first, unable to quite believe what they were seeing. But as more arrived, as confirmation spread that the serpent was genuinely dead, caution gave way to jubilation. People wept openly, embraced strangers, offered prayers of gratitude to every kami they could name, and to Susanoo they offered reverence that made him profoundly uncomfortable. They prostrated themselves before him, calling him savior and hero, offering tributes and promises of shrines in his honor. It was the kind of worship he had once craved, would have accepted as his natural due. But now, in his diminished state, and having learned something of humility through exile, it felt unearned. Yes, he had defeated the serpent, but only barely, and with more luck than he wanted to admit. He was no great hero of legend, no divine champion who had effortlessly swept away evil. He was just a god who had managed to do one good thing, and he found that the people's gratitude, genuine as it was, sat awkwardly on his shoulders. Lord Susanoo, Ashinazuchi said, approaching with Kushinada Hame beside him and his wife following behind. You have given us back our lives, our daughter, our future. There are no words sufficient to thank you. Then do not try, Susanoo said quietly. Simply, live. Live well and fully, knowing that you need never again sacrifice your children to appease a monster's hunger. Will you stay? Kushinada Hime asked, and her eyes holding that same mixture of hope and uncertainty that he had seen days before. In Izumo, we would build you a shrine, offer you worship and tribute. You would be honored as the greatest protector our province has ever known. Susanoo looked around at the assembled people, at their hopeful faces and their genuine gratitude. He thought about Kushinada Haime's offer from before the battle, her suggestion that he could have a place here, a home and purpose beyond wandering in exile. It was tempting, more tempting than he would have thought possible, to stay in this place where he had accomplished something meaningful, where people looked at him with admiration rather than fear or disappointment, to build a life around protecting these settlements, guiding them, and being the kind of kami that mortals spoke of with fondness, rather than terror, to perhaps explore what was growing between himself and the maiden whose life he had saved. That connection he did not yet fully understand, but could feel strengthening with each passing day. But even as the temptation rose, he felt something else, a pull, faint but unmistakable, from the direction of Takamagahara. Not an official summons, not divine command, but something more subtle. A sense that his actions here had been noted, that heaven itself had taken notice of the exiled storm god who had saved a province and slain a monster of primordial chaos. His redemption might not be complete, but perhaps it had begun. "I will stay," Susanoo said slowly, working through his thoughts even as he spoke them. "For a time, long enough to ensure that no other threats arise, that the Serpent's death does not create new problems, long enough to see this land truly at peace." Kushinada-Heime's face lit with genuine joy, and he found himself smiling in response despite his exhaustion and uncertainty. "But not forever," he continued, feeling the need to be honest, even if that honesty brought disappointment. "I am still in exile, still bound by heaven's judgment. Eventually, I will need to answer for my crimes in Takamagahara, to face whatever further tests the Celestial Court deems necessary. My presence here can only be temporary. Then we will treasure the time we have," Ashinazuchi said with quiet dignity. "And when you must leave, you will go with our blessings and our gratitude, and knowing that you have given Izumo the greatest gift imaginable, a future free from terror." The celebration that followed lasted 3 days. Susanoo participated reluctantly, uncomfortable with the constant attention and praise, but finding that he could not entirely reject the people's need to mark this momentous occasion. They held festivals in every village, lit bonfires that blazed through the night, prepared feasts that strained the resources of families who had little enough to spare. And through it all, Kusanagi no Tsurugi remained at Susanoo's side, the legendary blade that had turned the tide of battle. He studied it in quiet moments, marveling at the craftsmanship, the way divine power seemed to flow through the metal itself. This was something that transcended ordinary weaponcraft, something that belonged in the heavenly armories of Takamagahara. On the 4th day, after the battle, Susanoo made a decision. He called for Ashinazuchi and Kushinada-Hime, along with the most respected priest in the province, and made an announcement that surprised even himself. "Kusanagi no Tsurugi," he said, holding the blade before them, "is not mine to keep. It was forged for a higher purpose than serving as trophy of victory. This sword belongs with the imperial line, with those who will one day unite these islands under harmonious rule." He turned to Kushinada-Hime, and in that moment, a plan crystallized in his mind. A plan that would honor what had grown between them while acknowledging the realities of his temporary presence. "Kushinada-Hime," he said formally, "you faced death with courage I had never before witnessed. You showed me that mortality is not weakness, that accepting limitation can be its own kind of strength. You gave me a reason to be better than I was." He knelt before her, which shocked the assembled mortals. A god kneeling to a human, but felt right in a way that transcended protocol. "I ask, therefore, that you accept 2 gifts from me. First, this sword, to be held in trust by your family until the time comes when it can be properly presented to the imperial court. Second," he paused, the words feeling both momentous and inevitable, "my hand in marriage for whatever time we are granted together." Silence fell over the gathering. Kushinada-Hime stared at him with wide eyes, clearly struggling to process what she had just heard. Her parents looked equally stunned, joy and disbelief warring in their expressions. "You, would marry me?" she finally whispered. "A god would bind himself to a mortal? A god who learned from a mortal what it means to be truly brave?" Susanoo replied. "A god who found in this mortal province more worth and meaning than he ever knew in celestial paradise. Yes, Kushinada Heim. If you will have me, knowing that our time together must eventually end, knowing that I carry the weight of divine judgment still unresolved, yes, I would marry you." Her answer was to drop to her knees before him, tears streaming down her face, and take his hands in hers. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying simultaneously. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The wedding was held 7 days later, under the autumn moon that had once marked nights of terror, but now signified hope and new beginnings. It was a grand affair by mortal standards, and with representatives from every village in Izumo attending, but simple by the standards Susanoo had known in Takamagahara. No celestial music, no divine banquets, no displays of power that reshaped reality itself. Just two people pledging themselves to each other, witnessed by a community that had survived terror and emerged into peace. Just a god learning to be more human, and a human teaching a god what mortality could mean when lived with purpose and grace. And as Susanoo spoke his vows, binding himself to this woman and this land for as long as fate would allow, he felt something shift within him. The rage that had characterized his existence for so long, the constant fury at limitations and boundaries and expectations, it did not vanish entirely, but it transformed, became something that could be channeled, directed, used to protect rather than destroy. He was still Susanoo-No-Mikoto, the storm god, embodiment of chaos and wild nature, but he was also now something more. A protector, a husband, a member of a community rather than an exile wandering alone. And perhaps that was the redemption heaven had intended all along. Not a transformation from chaos to order, which would have destroyed the essential nature that made him who he was, but a channeling of chaos toward purpose. The same storms that could devastate could also water crops. The same lightning that could kill could also illuminate darkness. The same wind that uprooted trees could also carry rain to lands dying of drought. Power was neither good nor evil in itself. It was the intent behind its use, the wisdom guiding its application, that mattered. And the months that followed were strange and wonderful in equal measure. Susanoo adapted to mortal life with varying degrees of success. He learned to moderate his divine power, to exist among humans without constantly radiating the kind of overwhelming presence that made them fear or worship him. He helped with harvests, using his command over weather to ensure favorable conditions. He settled disputes, his divine authority giving weight to judgments that brought peace to conflicts that might otherwise have festered. And at night, in the home he shared with Kushinada Heim, he learned what it meant to be simply a man rather than a god, to find joy in small things, to understand that limitation was not prison, but framework within which meaning could be built. But always, in the background of his awareness, he felt that pull from Takamagahara, that sense that heaven was watching, evaluating, preparing some form of judgment or acknowledgement. His exile had been pronounced with finality, but nothing in the celestial realm was truly permanent for one of the three noble children. A year after the Serpent's defeat, on the anniversary of that battle, the summons finally came. It was not dramatic, no divine messengers descending in glory, no voice booming from the heavens. Simply a knowledge that appeared in Susanoo's mind, like memory of something he had always known. Heaven calls. Return and face judgment renewed. He stood in the garden of his home, Kushinada Jaime beside him, and felt the weight of that summons settling into his bones. He had known this moment would come, had prepared himself for it, but the reality still struck with the force of loss. "You must go," Kushinada Jaime said quietly. Not a question. She had always understood what their time together would be. Beautiful but temporary. A grace period between exile and whatever came next. "I must," Susanoo confirmed. He took her hands in his, memorizing the feeling of her touch, the way her mortal warmth contrasted with his divine nature. "But I will carry you with me. What you taught me, what we built here, that remains no matter what heaven decides. Will you return?" she asked, and beneath the calm acceptance in her voice, he heard the desperate hope of someone trying not to hope too much. "If I can," he promised. "If heaven allows. If..." He paused, struggling with uncertainty that still felt foreign to his nature. "If I am found worthy." They spent one final day together, walking through the province he had protected, visiting the places that had become meaningful to them both. They stood at the riverside where the Serpent had died, now transformed into a peaceful shrine where travelers could rest and offer prayers. They climbed to the overlook where the monster's cave had been. Now nothing but a cavern that birds nested in. All trace of wrongness burned away. And as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Susanoo-No-Mikoto prepared to ascend back to the celestial realm. "Whatever happens," Kushinada Jaime said, standing before him one last time, "know that you gave me life when death seemed certain. Know that you showed an entire province what it means when power is tempered with wisdom. Know that you were loved, aye, not just worshipped, and that love does not diminish with distance or time." Susanoo found he could not speak. Words felt inadequate, too small to contain what churned within him. So instead, he simply held her, this mortal woman who had taught a god what it meant to be better, and let that embrace speak what language could not. Then, as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to emerge, Susanoo released his hold on the limitations he had embraced during his exile. Divine power flared around him, no longer constrained, no longer diminished. Storm clouds gathered overhead, lightning danced between them, and wind began to swirl in patterns that defied natural law. But where once this display would have been wild and destructive, now it was controlled, purposeful. A storm that harmed nothing, that simply created the pathway between mortal and divine realms that he needed to traverse. He rose into that storm, lifted by winds of his own making, and looked down one final time at the woman he was leaving behind. She stood in the garden, face turned upward, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her expression peaceful, almost joyful. And Susanoo understood in that moment what she had always known, that some gifts were worth the pain of their loss, that love did not require permanence to be real, that meaning could be found in temporary things, if one had the courage to embrace them fully, despite their impermanence. He ascended, leaving the mortal realm behind, rising through layers of reality that grew progressively less solid and more luminous. The storm carried him higher, higher, until the earth below was nothing but a distant curve, until the sky itself began to take on the quality of the celestial. And then he was passing through the gates of Takamagahara, the heavenly plane that he had been cast out from what felt like a lifetime ago. The same gardens, the same perfect architecture, the same sense of eternal order that had once suffocated him with its restrictions. But he saw it differently now, not as prison, but as responsibility. Not as limitation, but as foundation upon which structure could be built. The chaos he embodied was still chaos, still wild and dangerous, but it had learned to exist in balance with order, to recognize that both were necessary, that neither could exist without the other. The assembled kami waited for him in the great hall of judgment, and the same place where his exile had been pronounced. They stood in ranks, the 8 million divine beings who made up the celestial court, their expressions ranging from curiosity to stern disapproval to cautious welcome. And at the center, radiating light that made the sun seem dim by comparison, stood Amaterasu, his sister, his judge, the one whose heart he had broken with his actions, whose trust he had shattered with his crimes. Susanoo approached and knelt before her, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect. He had learned what it meant to rule with wisdom, to bear the weight of others' lives in safety. He understood now what Amaterasu had always carried, what his chaos had threatened. "Brother," Amaterasu said, and her voice held neither anger nor welcome, but something more complex. Curiosity, perhaps, and carefully restrained hope. "You return to us changed." "I return to you humbled," Susanoo replied. "I return having learned what you tried to teach me, though the lesson came at great cost. I return not to claim vindication, but to accept whatever judgment you deem appropriate. Tell us," Amaterasu commanded, "what you have learned in exile." And so Susanoo spoke. He told of the child in the forest, and the serpent in the mountains, and the maiden who had accepted death with more courage than he had ever shown. He spoke of battles and victories, of failures and fears, of the slow transformation from God who raged against limitation to being who understood that power without purpose was not strength but waste. He spoke of love found and lost, of community rather than isolation, and of the strange joy that came from protecting rather than dominating. And he spoke finally of understanding what his nature truly meant, that he was storm, yes, but storms were not inherently destructive. They could be terrible when misused, but they could also be cleansing, necessary, the force that cleared away stagnation and allowed growth to occur. When he finished, silence filled the celestial hall. The assembled kami exchanged glances, communicating in ways that transcended speech, and Amaterasu studied him with eyes that saw through divine flesh to whatever passed for soul in the kami. Finally, she spoke. "Susanoo-No-Mikoto, your crimes in Takamagahara were grave. You violated sacred spaces, destroyed what had been carefully nurtured, caused death through carelessness and willful disregard for consequence. Exile was just, and we do not rescind that judgment or suggest it was error." Susanoo bowed his head, accepting her words. "But," Amaterasu continued, and something in her voice softened, "exile was never meant as permanent punishment. It was education, a way to show you what you could not see from within the comfortable certainty of celestial power. And in that education, it appears you have learned what we hoped you might." She descended from the judgment seat and approached him, this sister he had wronged, and who had nevertheless sent him to where redemption might be found. She reached out and lifted his chin, making him meet her eyes. "You slew Yamata no Orochi," she said, "a creature of primordial chaos that had resisted all previous attempts to bind it. You saved a province from terror. You recovered one of the 3 sacred treasures and ensured its safekeeping. And most importantly," she paused, and he saw genuine warmth in her expression for the first time since his exile. You learn to love something beyond yourself. Does that earn forgiveness? Susanoo asked quietly. It earns understanding, Amaterasu replied, and perhaps in time full restoration. But for now, she straightened, speaking with the formal authority of heaven's ruler. Your exile is reduced, but not ended. You may move freely between celestial and mortal realms, but Takamagahara itself remains closed to you for now. Return to Izumo if you wish. Serve as protector and guardian there. Continue to learn what it means to wield power with wisdom. Relief flooded through Susanoo, so intense it was almost painful. Not full forgiveness, not complete restoration, but the chance to return to the life he had built, to the woman he had married, to the purpose he had discovered. And perhaps, Amaterasu added, speaking more quietly now, for him alone rather than for the assembled court, someday you will tell me more of what you learned among mortals, for even we who dwell in heaven can benefit from understanding what we watch from such distance. Susanoo met his sister's eyes and saw there what he had almost forgotten. Not just the sun goddess, not just the celestial ruler, but the sibling who had loved him enough to punish him, who had hurt him in hopes of saving him from himself. Thank you, he said simply, for not giving up on me, even when I deserved it. That, Amaterasu said with the faintest smile, is what family means. Susanoo-No-Mikoto returned to Izumo on winds that sang with joy, descending from the celestial realm to the mortal world with a freedom he had not possessed during his exile. Kushinada-hime stood waiting in their garden, and when she saw him approaching, the carefully maintained composure she had held through his absence shattered into pure happiness. They embraced, and Susanoo felt the rightness of it settle into his bones, not the transcendent, perfect order of Takamagahara, but the complex, messy, beautiful imperfection of mortal existence. This was where he belonged, at least for now, where his nature could be fully expressed without causing catastrophe, where his power could serve rather than dominate. In the years that followed, Susanoo became legend, not the kind of legend he had once been in heaven, tales of chaos and destruction, warnings about divine rage uncontrolled, but something different. Stories of the storm god who protected Izumo province, who blessed crops with favorable weather and defended against threats both natural and supernatural. Tales of a deity who walked among mortals not as distant authority, but as guardian and, in his own strange way, friend. He and Kushinada-hime had children, which amazed him, the blending of divine and mortal, creating something neither and both, descendants who would carry his legacy forward when his time in the mortal realm eventually ended. Through these children, through the shrines that sprang up in his honor, and the festivals celebrated in his name, Susanoo found something he had never known in all his celestial existence. He found that he mattered, not because of the power he wielded or the fear he inspired, but because of what he had done and continued to do. Because he had chosen, when choice was available, to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down, to be more than his nature demanded. The people of Izumo told stories of him that spread throughout the islands. How he had slain Yamata no Orochi, how he had recovered Kusanagi no Tsurugi, how he had married a mortal woman and made his home among humans, how the storm god had learned to temper tempest with wisdom, and in time, these stories reached beyond simple legend to become something more, part of the foundation myths of the islands themselves, tales that would be told for thousands of years, teaching lessons about redemption and transformation and the possibility that even the most chaotic nature could find purpose. Susanoo himself rarely spoke of these things. He was not given to philosophy or deep reflection, even after everything he had learned. He remained, at his core, the embodiment of storm, passionate, powerful, unpredictable in the details, if not the essence. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when he sat with Kushinada-Heim and watched the sun set over the land he had saved, he would think about the journey that had brought him to this moment, would remember the arrogant god who had defiled his sister's palace, the exile who had wandered in rage and confusion, the warrior who had faced a primordial monster, the man who had learned to love. And he would understand, in those moments, what heaven had known all along, that power was nothing without wisdom to guide it, that strength was meaningless without compassion to temper it, that even a storm god needed to learn when to rage and when to gentle into nurturing rain. He had been cast down from heaven as punishment, but in falling, he had learned to rise in ways that transcended mere altitude, had discovered that redemption was not a destination, but a journey, not a single moment of transformation, but a choice made repeatedly, day after day, to be better than what came easily. Was he fully redeemed? Perhaps not. Perhaps that was work that would continue for as long as he existed, a process rather than a state, a becoming rather than a being. But he was trying, and in trying, had become something more than he had ever been before. Not just storm, not just God, but protector and guardian, and in his own tempestuous way, hero. The people of Izumo, and countless generations after them, would remember Susanoo-No-Mikoto not for his crimes in heaven, but for the salvation he brought to earth, would invoke his name during storms, asking for protection rather than fearing devastation, would tell their children stories of the God who learned to love, who proved that even divine nature could be transformed through wisdom and compassion. And somewhere in the celestial realm of Takamagahara, Amaterasu Omikami would smile and know that her brother, the storm god, had finally found the purpose that power alone could never provide.